Welcome to episode 197 of the Daniel Yoris podcast with today's guest, Paul Oneid. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Joined here today by Paul Oneid. Paul, thanks so much for being here and taking the time, man. I appreciate you.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. Thank you for having me on your platform and looking forward to the conversation.
It was great to meet at Swiss, as I've mentioned so many times on these podcasts that I've met so many great people through attending events and just meeting people in real life. And shout out, as always, to Andrew Coates for connecting us. But just, speaks to the importance of getting out there in the real world and actually like meeting good coaches, because there's lots of good people out there and great connections to be had. So happy to chat with you here today. I want to go back a little bit and talk about the injury that you've had that's a bit ago now, and you're through it, but it's one of these things that's you're going to take this with you for the rest of your life for sure. So can you, tell me about that.
Well, I mean, it could have. So for those who, most of your listeners probably don't know who I am. So actually 20 weeks ago on Sunday, I suffered a double quad tendon rupture. So when I was competing in a powerlifting meet, I was taking my third attempt squat at 750 pounds, which for all intents and purposes is like a 3-rep max for me. It was supposed to be a relatively easy attempt. The meet was kind of to shake the rust off. I had taken 2.5 years off competing and ended up losing my balance in the bottom, shifting my weight onto my heels. And when I went to stand up out of that bad position, my quads just popped. I had avulsion fractures of both my patellas. So essentially the tops of my patellas fractured off and took my quad tendon with it. Pretty routine surgery. They go in, they clean up the bone, they screw the tendon back to the top of the patella and then suture it up. The typical rehab timeline for something like that was supposed to be 6 weeks in a wheelchair, another 6 weeks walking on with a walker with your knees locked, and then slowly regaining mobility, starting some strength training, some strategic strength training to a point where at 20 weeks, you should be able to bodyweight squat. For reference, I was able to leg press 5 plates for 20 reps to better depth than before surgery on Friday. So wow. We're recording this on Tuesday, 5 days ago, leg press 5 plates, pain-free, no issues. So it could have taken me the rest of my life and I could have dealt with this, but I was very strategic with my rehab, and we'll go through all that stuff in the podcast. But I think most people look at these things as life-changing. I don't think it changed my life per se. It definitely allowed me to affirm the parts of my identity that I thought were true. And I used it as a tremendous learning experience. And to be fair, it's kind of been fun. It was weird to say that. But aside from that first 5.5 weeks in a wheelchair and needing my wife to take care of me, I've really dove into the science of recovery, all the things that I could control, really taking care of my mental health and my mindset throughout the whole process. And then using the resources that I have available to me with regards to the people that I've met at Swiss, people I've met through my career, to really dial in a rehab protocol that worked for me. And like that bodyweight squat that was supposed to happen at 20 weeks, it happened at like 10. And the numbers that I'm hitting now are numbers that you'd expect at that like 6 to 8 month mark. So for all intents and purposes, I probably shaved like 6 months off my rehab with the things that I did.
So I think the thing that I meant by that you'll take it with you for the rest of your life is not that you'll be injured and like, never strong again. Like that would be a disaster, but more that, you've learned a lot of lessons and some like things that you'll learn from the rehab and the actual technical side of things. But I'm sure that there's a gigantic, emotional and like life lesson attachment that's come with this. I know through my own injuries, there's been a whole lot of things that have shaped the rest of my life, and from a movement and exercise perspective, but also just like on a life outlook perspective. So where I want to start with this is more of like a timeline. So when the injury happened, if you can recall, what were some of the thoughts that were going through your mind, like right after it happened, once like the chaos was a little bit over?
Well, it's funny, man. So I ended up dumping the bar behind me and falling forward. So the time from when like I dumped the bar to the time my chest hit the floor, it felt like 10 minutes. You know, there's so much going through my head at that moment. Luckily there was no pain. It was
did you know what happened right away?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've been around the sport long enough, had enough injuries. I was like, my quads are gone. So the only thing going through my mind before I hit the floor was just acceptance. I was like, yep, I'm fucked up. I'm going to have to rehab. This is going to be shitty. I'm going to have surgery, and I'm ready for it. Let's go. I've always identified as someone who willingly does hard things and who continues to seek out hardships to make myself a better version of myself. And this was just going to be another opportunity for me to do that. The next emotional dump that I had was, so they rolled me over, took my equipment off, and then got me to the back room. They put me in a chair and then lifted the chair to the back room because I couldn't bend my legs. They had to keep them straight. And then I made eye contact with my wife, who was there. And it was at that point where I realized, like, yeah, the rehab would be hard for me, but it was her responsibility. Like, she was going to have to take care of me. I was going to be in a wheelchair. There was no two ways about it. And she has been absolutely incredible this whole process. The first few weeks, like, she was making all my meals. She was making sure I had all my supplements, all my medication, all my rehab stuff was all set up. We set up my office as a hospital room. And actually, rewind a little bit. We were actually in the Collingwood Hospital for 9 days because they couldn't discharge me. Because the whole deal with home care and getting equipment in the house, they had to confirm that I had equipment in the house before they could discharge me. But there was a terrible coordination of that. So once we got home, my office where we are right now turned into a hospital room. And I had all my rehab modalities set up. I had all my supplements. My meals were taken care of. I wrote out a meal plan for myself. She made 4 meals a day for me every day. Made sure I had water. And at this point, like, you know, full disclosure, there were times in the hospital until we got home, because of the nature of my injury and how I had to be positioned to avoid pain, I couldn't wipe my own ass. So guess who did that? And then when we got home, I couldn't get to the bathroom with the wheelchair because we have on our main floor where my office is, we just have a little, like a powder room. So I couldn't get the wheelchair into the powder room. So I had to use a commode. So the only movement I got other than going to physiotherapy was from the bed to the commode and back to the bed. So my life was this room for 5.5 weeks. So it was pretty heavy. And for me, one of the biggest insecurities that I have as a man is being a burden on other people. So this injury forced me to really attack that head on and figure out why I felt that way and how come it was so hard. And it really forced myself and my wife to communicate with one another about how we were feeling. I could tell she was overwhelmed. Like, my wife is an IFBB pro competitor. She has to take care of herself. She has to make her food, go train, take care of, she has a very high client load as well. On top of that, taking care of a 37-year-old toddler who can't take care of himself. It was a big burden on her, and she crushed it. She absolutely crushed it.
It's amazing that you have her in your corner for that. And I think that things like this, it almost flies over people's heads because they see you now, you know, big, strong dude, you're capable, you're fine now, like all things are good. Just to explain to you, Paul, and some people listening might know this, I had a big knee surgery 10 years ago now. I'll make it really short, but I was a non-weight bearing on the leg for 3 months and all this stuff. And very similar to you, like, I couldn't do anything on my own. And same thing, like, I had to ask my mom at the time. Well, I mean, my mom still helps me with lots of things, of course. Yeah. But I was 20, and I had to ask my mom to help me go to the bathroom, to help me do everything because I couldn't do anything on my own. And so when you say that you don't want to depend on other people, like, I personally very deeply feel that because it's different when, like, we both knew that we were going to get over that. These weren't like forever things like, oh, I'm never going to walk again. But it almost feels like that in the moment. Like I can't even go to the bathroom by myself. Like the most basic of things, you're completely, I felt useless is the word I would describe myself with. It feels useless. And this is why I think, all of your training and all of your knowledge has gotten you better faster than you would have otherwise.
Yeah.
And this is why like just training and fitness in general and health is so important. Because what if you didn't know those things? What if the situation was even was even worse, and this thing was lasting longer, and it was more unknown, and you're a different type of person, and maybe you could never go to the bathroom on your own again? And that's a realistic situation that a lot of people find themselves in, whether they're 37 or 97. I don't think it's going to feel any better when you're 97 and that happens. You're like, oh well, I'm an old man, so it's okay now. Like I think it's still going to feel really fucking shit. And the more that we can delay that or avoid it, the better. And that's why, like, for me, I have such a greater appreciation for fitness and wanted to give back, and it became my career, my life after that, is because of all that. And so that's why just to explain how I can, connect to you on that side of, feeling like you don't want to ask anyone for help, but knowing that you need to, and accepting that part of you that like, hey, it's okay to ask for help here.
One of the cool things about asking for help, and I've come to learn this and really lean into it as a way to be okay with asking for help, is we're coaches. We live a life of service. People ask us for help every single day, and we consider it an honor to be able to help the people that we help. My wife was showing me how much she loved me every single day when she, answered the call. And so for her, she felt grateful that she was able to show me love in that way, and to be able to support me in the way that she could, because in other aspects of our life, I support her in so many different ways. And that's how I show my love for her. And when we ask for help, whether it be from a parent or from a loved one, or even from friends, this allows them the opportunity to show us love, which is really a beautiful thing. And if we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to ask, we don't give them the opportunity. And, for me, that when I came to realize that and really leaned into it, it became really apparent how many amazing human beings I have in my life. Like when I started reaching out to, my coach leading into the meet, and for the 2 years prior, her name is Dani Lamartina, Dr. Dani Lamartina. And she's an absolute magician when it comes to strength training, rehab, hypertrophy, movement. She got me healthy from an injury. Like I had a chronic hip and knee problems. That's why I took the 2 years off prior to this competition. That pretty much lingered for 10 years. And I was able to do what I did in powerlifting despite that, but I just couldn't do it any longer. She got me healthy from that issue, able to the point where I was able to get back to the platform. So I reached out to her. She helped me a great deal. Ken Kanakin, who's the head of Swiss, helped me a great deal. Matt Nickel, who's the performance coordinator for the Senators, he helped me a great deal, lent me one of his rehab modalities to use at the house for 8 weeks. Dr. Chris Marvin, who's a chiropractor and strength coach down in Houston, who I connected with. He helped me a lot with some BFR protocols that I used. And then working with my physiotherapist here, hands-on, Ryan Morrison, who's with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Like Ryan and I worked really closely on my rehab plan to be able to get to a point where we were both comfortable with the progression. And, I wouldn't have been able to recover fast enough had I not asked for help.
Yeah. It's, you realize very quickly that like, hey, this is something that I can't do alone as much as I would want to. And I understand what you said, right at the beginning too, where some elements of this were fun, where it's like, okay, this is a giant puzzle to figure out.
Oh yeah.
And we like to nerd out, and it's like, these are the things. Okay, now I get to put my real thinking cap on, and I get to use all the shit that I know about physiology and nutrition and muscle building and rehab, and I get to pull out all the stops now, because for the most part, for Gen Pop clients, for the 99% of people out there, we're not dealing in the nitty gritty, niches of physiology and performance and stuff, because most of it comes down to find a way to eat a little bit less shit and find a way to exercise a little bit more, and then we're strategizing around that. But we're not really playing in the details there. So I understand how that could be a fun challenge to overcome, and it's always easier to like experiment on yourself rather than like reading about it just anecdotally or experimenting on other people, which is irresponsible to a degree. But one thing I did want you to touch on is the way that you had to advocate for yourself, for your own healthcare. Like all things about Canada, we're both Canadian, whatever. Our healthcare is quote unquote free, but there are things that you need to stand up and say, I need this, and you need to be in charge of what's happening to you. So can you give us a little bit of insight on like some of the things that you had to really advocate for and how important that was for your own well-being?
Yeah, for sure. So I had my surgery I was in the hospital July 13th. Excuse me. July 13th, I had my injury. July 14th on the Sunday, I had my surgery, and we were in the hospital until Monday that next following week. The reason was I was actually discharged on Wednesday. So it would have been surgery, 2 days in the hospital. They basically don't discharge you until you go to the bathroom because the painkillers stop you up. Mm-hmm. So that was a whole other story. But anyway, so they discharged me on the Wednesday. They couldn't let me out of the hospital because Ottawa Home Care wasn't communicating with Collingwood Home Care to get equipment delivered, because the occupational therapist in Collingwood did an assessment on me that Ottawa wouldn't accept until their occupational therapist did an assessment. But their occupational therapist couldn't assess me until I got to Ottawa, and I couldn't get my equipment until I got to Ottawa. And it took all this time to figure that out. And on Friday at 4 p.m., they decided it was a good time to try and get me to pay privately for my equipment, which I offered to pay 2 days before. I said, here's my credit card, put the shit in my house. Wouldn't do it. Finally, that Friday when they said, when we essentially found out that I'd be there over the weekend and nothing could be done, I broke down. That was the worst feeling ever. My wife and I both sat there crying. She was either in the hospital room with me or trying to find a hotel to stay at or figuring out where she was going to sleep. Luckily, we had some family friends in the area who allowed her to stay in their Airbnb. But on that Monday morning, they told me that it would be another 2 days before the equipment could be delivered. And I said, no, it won't. So I said, can I take care of this on my own? And they said, you can do whatever you want, but you're not going to be able to find anything. I said, hold my beer. Hold my morphine. I made 23 calls in 90 minutes and had equipment delivered 4 hours later. They could have been doing that all week, but they decided not to. And we got the equipment. The confirmation of delivery was received. My mother-in-law drove from Toronto to Collingwood to pick us up, drove from Collingwood to Ottawa, slept at our place, took our dogs, took them back to Toronto with her. Francis, absolute gem of a human being, saved our asses. And then the other part was physiotherapy. So home care, or like OHIP, Ontario Healthcare, will fund for, I think it was like 6 weeks of physiotherapy, which is fine. I mean, but they can't guarantee a timeline. So I actually didn't hear from the free physiotherapy for 13 weeks. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, I started physiotherapy 2 days after I got home from the hospital because I took matters into my own hands. I also found the surgeon to take over my care because otherwise I would have had to drive back to Collingwood for my follow-ups. Luckily, I'm good friends with the surgeon who did my knee surgery in 2015. I called Dave and I said, Dave, will you take over my care? I just tore both my quads. He's like, yep, sure. Come to the clinic. We just built a brand new clinic. You come by. Ended up going to physiotherapy 3 times a week to do some different modalities and some different protocols. And that lasted until I was able to be weight bearing. So about 7 or 8 weeks. Then I went down to once a week and now it's once every 2 weeks. But I paid all that out of pocket. I know most people aren't in the situation where they can pay $165 a pop 3 times a week to go to a physiotherapist. I'm very fortunate to be in a position. We make good money and I was able to afford that. But that's, I had to advocate for that for myself. Otherwise, I would have been in a wheelchair for 12 weeks.
And that's the situation where the actual physical part of the injury does last for basically forever. If you just did nothing for 13 weeks until they got you someone, and then that someone is, 15 phone calls just to get them to come by the house. And then by the time they do, like, your legs are destroyed by that time anyways. And then they come once a week and it's only for 6 weeks. And then, we got to get approval for more funding or for more whatever. And you would have missed out on all of the rehab from that.
Yeah. I mean, the rehab process itself, like, I didn't take any measurements. I should have, but I didn't. I lost a significant amount of muscle mass in my legs, but it could have been way worse. Way, way worse. The other thing is if you wait 12 weeks to weight bear, you're also missing out on the functional benefits of movement that facilitate recovery. So, I mean, I'm so grateful that I advocated for myself in that regard, but it could have been an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, not an easy thing to do, especially in the midst of just, like, this wasn't a planned surgery, so this all just happened. And for context, like, Collingwood is like a 6-hour drive to Ottawa, 6 hours, 7. Is it that far? I guess
so. 6.5.
Yeah, with traffic, anything near Toronto adds an hour and a half of traffic. But yeah, so it's not close. So chaos just with like, oh shit, this just happened. Now we gotta like deal with it. Mm-hmm. It would be very easy to just kind of like shut down and be like, oh, woe is me, and whatever the doctor says, and it'll just happen. And for some stuff, like, it's fine. You gotta just trust the system and see what happens. But you're probably most of the time better off not doing that and at least asking questions, at least saying, hey, can we get this? Hey, can we get this faster? Hey, what about this? Because most of the time the answer is yes. The unfortunate truth is that the squeaky wheel gets greased. And so you don't want to feel like you're being an asshole demanding things. But if you don't do that a little bit, it's just going to be bad for you. In anything.
I have a very unique way of being very forceful with my language while also being very polite. You learn that over time. So I was never rude to anybody, but I definitely push buttons and ask questions that they didn't necessarily like answering. And when it came to the physiotherapy stuff, like I said, I started therapy 2 days after we got home. So I was doing, at any point during the first 6 weeks, up to 8 hours of rehab related activities per day. Whether it was sitting with my muscle stim on, or sitting with a PEMF unit on, or sitting with my feet elevated on a foam roller so I could get passive extension through my knees, or just working through some ranges of motion, or doing straight leg raises, or doing blood flow restriction. I was doing all of that while in a hospital bed. Most people, most of the time, would not be doing those things. Right. So even though I was quote unquote non-weight bearing during that first 6 weeks, I was still very active in my rehabilitation process, so that when my feet hit the floor, everything moved that much faster.
Of those things that you were doing that you just mentioned, would you say that any of them felt like they moved the needle more than others? Or was it just the combination of all of it where we're just trying to get some movement in, make sure the muscles know that they still exist, and like trying to, use them a little bit? Was there anything that's like, oh, this one feels like, and you would have no way to prove this really other than just your own personal experience, but did anything move the needle more than others?
I think it was the combination, because I did so much stuff, right? So you're talking about, optimizing for passive rehabilitation with a PEMF, then with facilitated rehabilitation with the muscle stim, then with active rehabilitation with the, straight leg raises, hip exercises, things like that. Then combining that with passive blood flow restriction. It all worked together synergistically, because whenever I approach a problem with fitness and training, I approach it from a needs analysis. So initially it was, I have to heal this bone around the screws, because that's a timeline you can't get away from. That first 6 weeks of non-weight bearing, you cannot put tension through the quad because the anchors aren't set. So the way it was explained to me was, they basically secured my quad tendon with wood screws and fishing line. So you don't want to put tension through wood screws and fishing line because you'll just re-tear. Mm-hmm. But what can we do? Well, we can put an electrical stimulus through the muscle to wake it up. Cool. I'm going to do that 3 times a day. We can prevent insulin resistance in the muscle tissue by creating a hypoxic environment with blood flow restriction. Because for those of you who don't know, if you immobilize a muscle for more than 2 days, it loses all insulin sensitivity, which means it cannot uptake glucose, which means it essentially becomes metabolically dormant. By using a blood flow restriction strategy, you can create almost a pseudo exercise environment where you can get those carbohydrate receptors to translocate to the outside the cell and protect your insulin sensitivity to the tissue. So prevent atrophy. Then we looked at, okay, I have to heal the bone. Okay, PEMF is shown to increase bone density, and it will help with ATP synthesis, and it will upregulate the electromagnetic signals between cells so they heal faster. Cool, I'm going to spend 4 hours a day in that thing. All right, well, now I have to get range of motion back. The most important part is extension. So I spent 4 hours, well, probably an hour and a half a day sitting in passive extension. So I would just raise my heels on a foam roller so that my knees were unsupported and they could hang down. And I did that. All the while, keep in mind, I'm still working. So I have this like little desk that I could slide on top of my lap from beside the bed. I would slide it on, put the PEMF on, and I would work while I was doing stim or doing PEMF. I would take calls. I actually did podcasts in the hospital bed, which is kind of funny. So there's a bunch of episodes on our channel where I'm in a hospital bed doing podcasts.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I don't think there was one thing that moved the needle, but I definitely attacked each one of the needs of recovery. Not to mention the nutrition changes, right? So I ended up supplementing with collagen, supplementing with vitamin C because vitamin C is a cofactor for collagen synthesis, supplementing with a number of herbal anti-inflammatories, high dose omega-3s, and then also supplementing with peptides. And, I was already on testosterone replacement, so I continued that along with 10 milligrams of oxandrolone, which is a derivative of testosterone, but is very specific to collagen synthesis. It's actually used in burn victims and AIDS patients to prevent atrophy. So I implemented that at a very low dose, and growth hormone. So we're attacking hormones, we're attacking nutrition, we're attacking active rehab, we're attacking passive rehab, and then I'm also sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night.
Right. So everything. And the kitchen sink.
I did everything. Everything right. That is supported, everything that is unsupported, quote unquote. I did everything. Yeah.
I love that approach, of course. I don't think most people would be able to do all those things, not from they can't do it, but from there's so many things that and that you've learned and people that you have access to and whatever through our line of work. That these things will be so far out of thought. Right. I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the thing for most people to take away from that is if you have any type of injury, traumatic or a minor thing, you got to get it moving. That's going to be the thing that's going to of all of those things, you can probably do all of the other stuff, but if you just don't move and do no active anything on making the joint or muscle or tissue move, none of that other stuff is really going to stick.
Yeah. And you have to be careful because a lot of the quote unquote movement I was doing, I was still in a knee extended position because you can't bend right. The knee under tension for that first 6 weeks. The one message I would say if ever you're injured is to look at the things you can control. And in most cases, unless you're dealing with, a traumatic injury where you legitimately are not allowed to move, you can control your nutrition. You can control your sleep. You can control your stress. You can control, the active and passive rehab that you do. There's a lot within your control. I leaned on my wife's commitment to my rehab a lot as a motivator, right? Because you get into these dark places where you're just discouraged. And I put up a very brave face, and for all intents and purposes, I was doing very well mentally, but I was also working very hard on doing well mentally. And I used the control that I had over the nutrition, the rehab, the rest as a means to say, okay, I can't be upset here because I'm working so hard towards a goal and I'm seeing positive results. So I'm just going to keep doing the things. And that mentally, that's more relieving than anything. not to mention it's relieving for my wife because she's saying like, okay, this guy's working his ass off to get better. I'm going to keep helping him.
Yeah, you're not just succumbing to the injury and then feeling sorry for yourself and wishing that it's going to get better without actually doing anything about it. I would even bet that even if all of those rehab modalities, supplements, peptides, whatever, if all that stuff actually did nothing physically, if you just thought that it did, and you had a positive mindset of like, hey, I'm doing stuff to like help myself here, and that's going to keep you like out of the gutter for a lack of a better word, mentally, like that alone is going to move the needle a ton on your rehab. Versus even if you just feel like shit and you're like, well, this just sucks, I'm gonna lay in the bed and just wait for it to get better. Like having a positive attitude, although it's extremely difficult, is massively beneficial in those moments. And I think it really does come from other people that are there supporting you.
Absolutely.
Like if you were doing that alone, besides the fact that you literally wouldn't have been able to, it would have been infinitely harder. I know it would have been for me. It would have been impossible. So I can only imagine the same for you.
Yeah, for sure.
So with the rehab now, what more specifically did you do on the nutrition side of things? How did you change your nutrition up?
So the one thing that I want to be very weary of is gut health. So I have dealt with GI issues in the past, probably for the last 3 or 4 years, kind of had a finicky GI and done a number of different things that worked well, to the point where before the injury, my gut was in a really good place, but then the painkillers just kind of set it off. So making sure that I was, number one, maintaining my body weight as best that I could. I had no way to actually know what my body weight was because I couldn't stand on a scale. But I really worked on listening to my hunger cues, which there were none. So I wrote a meal plan for myself that had about 220 grams of protein in it. And then I think it was around 27 or 2,800 calories, which is low for me. My maintenance calories are around that 35 to 4,000 range. At the time of my injury, I was 252 pounds. So big boy. And so that was number one. So eating enough calories. You do not want to diet when you're hurt, because if you restrict your calories, you will restrict the amount of building blocks that are available to repair the tissue. So that's number one. Number two, whole foods and a ton of water. So I'm drinking 4 liters of water a day at a minimum. All my meals are whole foods. The next is fermented foods. So making sure that I'm having a serving of Greek yogurt a day, making sure that I'm having at least 50 to 75 grams of kimchi or sauerkraut with each one of the meals that I'm eating that contains meat, and then having at least 150 to 200 grams of vegetables per meal, and then 2 to 3 pieces of fruit. So eating tons of whole foods, tons of fruits and vegetables, making sure that my bowel movements are consistent and normal, which was a process, especially going through all the medications and stuff. But that's pretty much it. Supplementation wise, I added collagen to my diet because obviously you're repairing tendon. You want to supply with the specific amino acids that are responsible for that. And there was some conflicting research there. Lane Norton actually did a review explaining how collagen supplementation didn't improve tendon recovery. I have no way of knowing whether that's true or not, other than the fact that my recovery has been super fast and I've supplemented with collagen. So I'm going to continue to do that. The other thing to remember about collagen is it is very much effective for improving gut health because it repairs the gut lining. Then I also increased my omega-3, as I said before. I added some curcumin, added some vitamin C, added some vitamin K2 for my bone health, vitamin D supplementation. Also started using a supplement called Boswellia, which is very similar to curcumin in terms of its anti-inflammatory effects, but it is said to have tendon-specific inflammatory benefits. And then other than that, it was just being consistent. We still had one nice meal a week where my wife would wheel me into the living room and we'd enjoy a meal. At that point, I was able to transfer to the couch. So I could get to the couch and everything was good. But it was just really focusing on eating enough to support my recovery. And I ended up doing an okay job. I lost, I think, 9 pounds during the time in the wheelchair, which I'm sure came from my quads, like all of it. But I remember looking in the mirror. So I hadn't stood up and looked in a mirror. I could just like look down and see like, oh, my abs are not there anymore. Fuck. I took a picture. I posted on my Instagram of like, I lost 11 pounds or lost 9 pounds and I got fat. Fuck. That's since changed. But it was pretty disheartening, I will say.
That's a good anecdote for the people who get like a little too bogged down about stuff that changes on the scale. Like, cause obviously this is not a common scenario, but like you lost weight and got fatter relatively, right? That's why body fat percentage is like more, not that you got fat, but you know what I mean, right? Like you're just saying.
Yeah. I think a lot of it was just muscle tone because I didn't train for 6 weeks. Like I didn't go to the gym. So the only like actual physical activity I was doing is we were going swimming twice a week.
Okay.
So I would go swimming. They would wheel me into the pool and I would be in my knee braces in the pool to keep my knees locked. But I was fucking moving 30 minutes nonstop, kicking my feet, just trying to move. And honestly, it felt so good. Like moving my body because my lower back was getting super jacked up. Mm-hmm. I started getting sciatica, my hip, was from being in that bed and moving around again. And that felt so good. And I actually kept that up for the first probably 16 weeks, swimming twice a week. The only reason I stopped is because I'm a huge pussy. It started to get cold and I didn't want to get in a cold pool at 6 a.m.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's fair enough. Just a pussy.
Do you find that you have an overall just like greater appreciation for small things like just being able to move since all this?
Bro, I have a walking pad. I use it all day. I'm getting like 13,000 steps a day just because I'm like, I got to move my feet. I'm doing cardio every day. I'm like, I got to move my feet. But in general, I think it's just a greater appreciation for my own resilience. Like I'm not very good at giving myself credit. I'm not very good at like praising myself. I think a lot of men deal with that, but I will say like, I'm very proud of how I responded to this. And, I think I learned a lot. And again, it just kind of galvanized the identity that I felt that I had. Now I know that I have it. And, it's just going to help. It just helped me become a better person. Gave me a ton more empathy and, really moved the needle in that regard.
All those nutrition changes that you were just outlining and the supplementation, how different is that from your regular routine? Maybe the calories are different if you're trying to gain or lose weight, but how different is that setup?
Not very. The only thing that was really adjusted was the addition of the collagen and the few of the other supplements. Those have since been cut out now that I'm just back to training and being a normal human being. And then the calorie count's probably like 60% of what it usually is.
Yeah, makes sense. That's what I expected as well, just because as you're outlining it and just wanted to highlight it, that like you didn't say anything that was like so radical, like, oh, I'm eating this special, root something or other from the hills of whatever, that like this is what healed my quads. Like no, we're eating like whole foods. We're eating like what a normal person should be eating like most of the time. Yep. And that, shocker, is the best thing for healing and keeping you healthy. And you add in a couple other supplements just to fill in some gaps, but like mostly you're just doing the things that you're doing anyways, and you're probably a little bit more dialed in with it just because there's like a little bit more urgency with it during that time. But like otherwise sounds like should be what we should mostly be doing.
I do want to throw a caveat in there. So I did mention testosterone replacement, and I did mention some peptides.
Yeah, so let's talk about that.
The caveat that I have here is that a lot of people, especially if they are enhanced, will say, "Oh, I'm injured and I need to heal fast. I need to take more drugs." There is an inverse correlation between dosage of testosterone and collagen synthesis. So there's actually a link between high doses of testosterone and tendon injury. But low testosterone can also lead to tendon injury as well. So if you are someone who is, going down the route of enhancement to heal from an injury, being above your physiological range will actually do you a disservice in your healing process. So that's the caveat that I'll have there. That's
definitely a good thing to note, because I could easily see how one would make that leap. Like, oh, well, if a little bit is good for me, if I'm trying to get even better, I should just do more.
If I want to regrow my muscle, I'm going to take a buttload of gear. It's like, well, maybe the muscle will get bigger, but the tendon will not. And that's when you run into issues.
Right. The same thing would be true. Like if that were true, then just do that all the time, and there'll be no downsides. Just blast as much as you can and fucking hope for the best and hold on if you can.
Don't tease me with a good time.
So that's good to note on the testosterone side of things. The peptides. This is obviously a new-ish or new in the mainstream kind of thing that's coming up. What were you using? How did you use it? Give us a rundown.
Sure. So the two main peptides I used were BPC 157, which is a gastric peptide. We all produce it, but it is very, very effective in collagen synthesis, in tissue healing, in vascularization, and anti-inflammation. The other peptide is thymosin beta 4 or TB500, which again, collagen synthesis. It's also very effective for vascularization, cell proliferation, and anti-inflammation. So both of them used together, very synergistic. The thing to remember about peptides is, with the exception of TB500, if you have a history of thyroid cancer, you probably shouldn't take that. But the only side effect to these drugs is a wallet deficiency. Like they're not going to do any harm to you because they are produced naturally within the body, having elevated levels, not necessarily correlated to any issues. The third peptide that I used was one that I was newly introduced to during this process, is called GHK copper or GHKCU. And that is a peptide that is specific to collagen synthesis. And it's actually used very heavily in cosmetics. So I used all three of those, 500 micrograms each of the BPC 157 and the TB500 per knee per day, and then 2 milligrams of the GHK copper per knee per day. And so for those faint of heart, I looked at my scar and I essentially traced my scar and just kind of moved around the injection every day, because these drugs act locally to where they're injected. Because I was also working on my gut health, I did supplement with oral BPC 157, again, a gastric peptide, very effective in repairing gut lining and improving digestive function. So I was supplementing with 1,000 micrograms of BPC 157 orally as well. Did I go overboard with the BPC 157? Probably. But again, I'm in a position where I could afford it, and I know there's no side effects. I had used it with great success in the past in healing my gut. And I'm happy with the results.
It's always so interesting to me when we talk about these kind of things that are kind of new or, controversial in some circles or whatever. And it's like, oh, but it's in like makeup products. It's in like this other like very normal, just accepted thing. It's just like maybe it's called something different, or it's just an ingredient in an ingredient soup of things and we don't realize it. But the interesting part of that to me is that we need things like cosmetics and just beauty and superficial quote unquote things to like fund research for things that have like more important impacts in life. Is like so many of the peptide stuff is about beauty and skin and hair and nails and all this stuff, but like it's actually way more impactful for just our general health. But like there's no one wants to be the experimenter on that or pay money for that. But if you say, oh, you buy this thing, it's $500, it'll make your skin glow a little bit more, and yeah, sure, sign me up. Yeah,
exactly. So I used all three together for about 10 weeks, and then I continued the BPC 157 and TB500 for an additional 2 weeks ago. It's like 18 weeks total for those two. Basically until I was fully healed and good to go. I kept those in. But I cut the GHK copper out because my scars were already healed really well. And I figured that the other two could do a good job. Also, it gets expensive. So sure.
Does the BPC 157 and the TB500, do they have to be used together? I've seen conflicting things on this where people are like, you should use it together, or you have to use it together. What is it about that?
If you have a muscular injury, I would use them together. If you have a tendon injury, you can get away with BPC on its own.
Got it. And if it is like a muscular tendon, a physical injury, you should inject it locally, because I've seen again where people don't want to inject things, and so they take it orally. And while that might be okay, it's probably way less effective, right?
So BPC 157, TB500 is not bioavailable orally. So if you're taking it orally, you're flushing your money down the toilet. BPC 157 is bioavailable orally only when combined with an arginine ester. So only if it's attached to arginine. So you'll see like a BPC 157 arginate. You can take that orally, but it's not systemically effective. There's conflicting evidence here. I haven't seen anything to support that oral BPC will improve tendon health, but I have seen great results in BPC 157 for gut health, which makes sense because it's absorbed in the gut. So, if you are encountering an injury and you're looking to take these peptides, I would inject them locally. It's just an insulin syringe. You don't even notice it. Just don't be a baby.
To your knowledge, is there any reason to take these things just regularly if you are injury prone or if you have little nagging things, or is it just take it to heal an injury and then just stop it? Not because there's anything wrong with it. It's just it's not doing anything good either.
So one of the things that I've learned recently is that your body does develop antibodies to peptides. So if you were to take something chronically, your body would develop antibodies for it and its effectiveness would drop. So if you were going to take these peptides, you'd want to cycle them. And for all intents and purposes, like, you shouldn't be dealing with nagging injuries. If you are dealing with nagging injuries, look at your training and look at your recovery, because you're probably not training optimally. I hate to use that word, but you're probably not training to the best possible outcomes. And you're probably doing too much training. And then you could look at your movement capacity and see like, hey, am I limited in my mobility? Am I limited in my resilience? Do I need better positional tolerances and things like that? Because you can address a lot of nagging injuries with better training. So I personally don't use these drugs unless I have a traumatic injury.
That makes sense on the cycling due to the antibodies. And the thing that immediately pops up for me, because I've heard this multiple times, is with all like the GLP-1s and the Ozempics and the whatever, these are peptides as well, that the common knowledge is like, well, once you start taking this, you're just taking it for forever. And if they're going to start to become less effective, well, then you got to take more. And like, great if you're the owner of the pharmaceutical company, but like maybe not so great for everyone else if it's just going to have diminishing returns over time. Like, that doesn't sound like a good long-term look.
So I've recently gone down a rabbit hole with the GLP drugs because I find them absolutely fascinating. Mm-hmm. So one of the issues with them is the effects on hunger blunting. So essentially, for those unfamiliar, the main reason why these drugs assist in weight loss is because they just make it easier to say no than to say yes, right? So it makes it easier for you to put your fork down. It makes it easier for you to pass on dessert, and it does it through a number of mechanisms. But the other mechanisms that it operates on, increasing insulin sensitivity, improving glucose mobilization at the liver. These newer generation drugs have multiple effects. They're also neuroprotective, they're kidney protective, they're cardioprotective. They actually assist in bone density improvements. They've been used in addiction therapy because they act on the brain. So there's a ton of different effects. They're anti-inflammatory because if you have better insulin management, it'll decrease your cortisol. So there's a ton of benefits to these drugs, and all of those benefits are seen at a very low dose. I would be very curious to see long-term data on low dose usage of these drugs, because if we're having better insulin management, decrease in inflammation, better fuel utilization, we should see some pretty drastic improvements in health outcomes. That being said, I don't believe that you should be taking anything all the time. But if you're putting these drugs in intermittently at very low dosages, to be fair, I don't see any negative ramifications of that. I look at these drugs for those who are struggling with obesity, struggling with developing habits. I look at them very similar to the way SSRIs or antidepressants are used in the treatment of mental health. They allow you to slow down enough to learn the habits and tools to manage your mental health, so that when you pull them out, you implement the tools and you're able to move forward. Sounds like a pretty reasonable paradigm to look at these through. So if you are putting these in to blunt the food noise, to make it a little bit easier to implement some of the habits and strategies that you're working on with your coach, and then you pull them out for a period of time where you practice the habits and strategies, and then you want to make a push for more weight loss again, you put them back in, and then you pull them out and you put them back in. that to me is a more sustainable way to use these drugs, especially when it comes to those individuals who have, 50% of their body weight to lose.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a ton of sense. I think the missing gap there that we all know is that the education and the accountability and the coaching doesn't like come with it, right? Like, this is great, and if people could do this, and it's the same, it would be the same thing with the mental health drugs. How many people are actually given a quality therapist or someone to help them through it, other than just like, take this drug, take it once a day and come back in 6 months and we'll see what's up. And that's why there's so many negative stories with these things, and they don't end up solving the issue. Because if you're just taking Ozempic or Mounjaro or any whatever the other ones are now, and you come off it, well, you didn't learn any habits. You're just going to go right back to whatever you were doing before. And it's not even different than people doing crash diets. You want to cut out all the carbs out of your life, like, fine, you do that for 3 months, and yeah, you'll lose some weight for sure. And then what? And then you go back to what you were doing before and you gain all the weight back. Like, this is not, it shouldn't be a surprise. So it really should come. I don't know how to facilitate this. I don't know if you have any ideas, but I don't know how to facilitate, like, how do we globally let people in on some coaching and some guidance to go with this to really make it stick?
I think we have conversations like this where we educate people on best practices, and we don't demonize them or make them feel like shit for having to take these drugs or deciding to take these drugs. And we advocate for healthy lifestyle choices as the main way to prevent weight loss recidivism, right? Like, I look at our roles as coaches. We have a company, we have 7 coaches in our company, and each one of them is incredibly good at forming relationships, providing empathy, communicating, educating, because that's what creates long-term changes. And if we need something, and this is not like, we're not putting our clients on this. If our clients are prescribed it, we know how to manage. But if you put yourself in a position where you can learn from somebody on how to sustain these lifestyle habits for the long term, and who have experience dealing with these drugs, now you're in a position where you're setting yourself up for success. So I think we just need to talk about it more.
Is that also part of the reason why some bit of the injury recovery is a little bit fun? Because from a professional standpoint, you get to say, hey, I get to go through a new experience. I hope this never happens to anyone, but it will, where people are going to go through traumatic injuries that are the same or similar to that. And like, hey, I've got some experience to pull from that, to one, technically coach that person through it, and 2, connect with them as a human.
Dude, my toolbox is fucking massive now. Like, even just the way that I approach training all right, let's rewind a little bit. So the progression typically for a rehab from this sort of injury is going to be around 24 weeks. So you have a 6-week period where you are quote unquote immobile, but you can passively increase your range of motion by 10 degrees per week. So you're in these braces that have a hinge, and that hinge locks at a certain degree of range of motion. So every week you increase by 10 degrees. Cool. Because I was doing so much rehab, I was almost at full range of motion at week 8, but I should have been up to like week 12, right? 10 degrees of range of motion, 12 weeks, 120 degrees. Well, if that's 12 weeks, then we have to go back to the top, and we have to develop tendon resilience at each one of those degrees. So that's where you would perform isometric contractions every single day within these ranges of motion, increasing by 10 degrees per week. That puts you at 24 weeks. Then once you have full range of motion with isometrics, now you can load within your full range of motion. What I did is I told my physiotherapist, I was like, this is stupid. No, there is no research that you can show me on someone who tore their quads with a quad that could squat 800 pounds. Mm-hmm. There is no research on anyone who is doing all of these rehab modalities. There is no research on anyone who is taking these supplements and doing this nutrition strategy and resting. He's like, you're right. They said, can we put some functional benchmarks in place? He's like, sure. So we followed it. Said, okay, as soon as I can get full range of motion, I'm going to start back at the top and I'm going to do my isometrics. What I also did is, as soon as I could do my isometrics, I looked at any of the exercises that I could do loaded, and I trained those to failure. So Anyone who's familiar with hypertrophy training knows that to get a hypertrophy stimulus, you need to train at a close proximity to failure. Cool. So as soon as I could train to close proximity of failure, I would do my isometric contractions. So I would do seated leg curl, laying leg curl, leg extension, and leg press. So if it was at 30 degrees, I would do my isometrics across the board at 30 degrees, 2 sets, 1 minute. Then I would do abductors to failure, adductors to failure. I would do hip thrusts. And at that point I could stand. So I would do RDLs. That's quite a bit of loading. And I would train that loading every other day. But my isometrics I would do every day. On the opposite days, I would train upper body. And I kept my upper body volume relatively low because I wanted to be able to train lower body hard and I didn't want my recovery to be impacted. So I did like a baseline, probably 1 or 2 sets on upper body, maybe 5 sets total per muscle group. So very low volume. Now, I told my physiotherapist, I said, I'm going to progress my isometrics as soon as I can do the isometric without shaking. So there's 2 things you need to remember with tendon injuries. You're going to deal with neurological downregulation, which means your nervous system just doesn't want to fire when there's pain. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a lack of coordination, which is going to cause you to shake. So I said, as soon as I can do these without shaking, I'm going to progress my range of motion. He's like, sure. Turned out it was like every 3 or 4 days, I could increase the range of motion. Cool. So I got full range of motion with isometrics by about week 10. So again, 4 weeks to get isometric strength back. Then I kept the isometrics in at full range, but then started loading back at the top. So I would load through, I think I started back at 50 degrees. So I would do leg extensions. Actually, the leg extension was the only one I did full range because I was doing it unweighted in blood flow restriction. So I would do full range leg extensions unweighted. So just sitting in a chair doing leg extensions with the blood flow restriction. But I would do leg presses. I would do leg curls to full range because I wasn't loading through my quad. So I was able to train the hamstring really strong. And what that allowed me to do is because I was training the hamstring, I would get reciprocal inhibition of my quads. So my quads would relax and then I could get more range of motion out of them. I would still do my adductors. I would still do my hip thrusts. I would still do my RDLs. And then I started getting into partial squatting, leg pressing, assisted squatting. And I progressed that range of motion until at about, it was 91 days actually. 91 days after my surgery, I did an unweighted bodyweight squat. And then 92 days after that, and then at 1 day after that, I did goblet squats. Because I'm like, bodyweight squats are stupid. I'm just going to load it. No pain, nothing. The one thing that I am kind of dealing with on an ongoing basis is as my loaded range of motion is improving, as my hips are opening up and as I'm able to access more full range depth in squatting exercises, like pendulum squatting is one of the most challenging ones because it just loads directly through the quad. I'm getting a little bit of discomfort in my posterior knee because what's happening is there's a bit of a lack of coordination between calf, hamstring, and tibial head. So there's a little bit of rotation happening there. But working with Danny, there's a couple drills that I put in place and that's immediately gone away. So kind of addressing things as I go, as new ranges open up, as I get stronger, there's going to be things that pop up and you just kind of have to deal with it. You listen to your body. There's a few key things that you need to remember when you're recovering. You can push your recovery very hard, but if the next day your swelling doesn't return back to baseline, you've done too much. Take a rest day. If your mobility, so if your range of motion doesn't return back to baseline or improve the following day, you've done too much. Take a rest day. I listened to that. Luckily, I dosed it properly and I didn't have any days like that. I didn't have any days where I had a regression. The leg size came back really quickly because my hamstrings, my adductors, my glutes, they got really, really strong. I was still able to load through the quads using blood flow restriction. Another cool thing that I did actually with the blood flow restriction So I mentioned blood flow restriction helps with creating that pseudo exercise environment to prevent atrophy. The other thing that it does is it decreases pain. So because the discomfort of that hypoxic environment supersedes the joint pain that you're having, you can actually get more range of motion in your mobility work. And because you can spend more time in those ranges of motion that previously caused you pain, you're more likely to keep those ranges of motion after. So as soon as I got full range of motion in my knees back to the point where I could ride a bike, I threw the blood flow restriction on and I would ride the bike every day. And because I was spending so much time in deep knee flexion with the BFR on the bike, my range of motion got really, 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 really good, really, really, really fast. And I still use blood flow restriction every leg day that I train. I was training legs every other day, then it was every 3 days, then it was every 4 days, and now it's twice a week. Because the loads that I'm lifting now, I'm actually training legs.
Are there any of those things that you think that has it changed your training for forever? Like, will you train differently? Assuming like we snap your fingers, you're like good from the injury, like no little nagging things. Anything that you're going to change?
I'll always include some element of blood flow restriction, either every other week or every week, just because I think it's a phenomenal tool. Not only can you train to failure with very light weights, it's very joint friendly, but there's a whole number of secondary and tertiary benefits with regards to vascularization, mitochondrial health, things like that. The other is the implementation of isometrics. So isometric training, it's so underutilized. Number one, if you have any sort of tendon injury, isometrics upregulate collagen synthesis much, much more than loading through ranges. The other thing is if you're performing isometrics for strength training, you get a carryover of plus or minus 15 degrees. So if you do an isometric at 30 degrees, you'll get stronger at 15 and at 45. So there is a transfer of training there. The third is if you're training for hypertrophy, the best hypertrophy outcomes happen when you're training at very long muscle lengths. So if I can spend more time at long muscle lengths by implementing isometrics, I should be leveraging that stretch mediated hypertrophy to a higher degree. So the strategy that I typically will use is usually I do 2 to 3 working sets on most of my exercises to 0 RAR or to failure or beyond failure sometimes. But what I'll do is that first set will be heavy as in like the most load I can lift for the rep range. So if it's 8 to 12, I fail in between 8 and 12 reps with the most weight that I can lift, obviously lifting with good form, making sure that I'm using the muscle that I'm trying to train. But then that second set, I will implement some sort of isometric hold or some sort of tempo so that I can better connect to the target muscle. I can better leverage that stretch mediated hypertrophy, and I can develop better tissue resilience at those longer muscle lengths. So an example would be, I did a push workout today. So my incline bench press, I did my first set. I did 130 pound dumbbells for a set of 9. And then the back down set, I went down to 100 and I used a 4-second down, 2-second pause tempo. Another strategy that you could use is something like a squeeze cluster. So I wanted to improve my knee flexion. So on a leg curl, where I'm spending time in that flexed position, I would do a first set heavy, 8 to 12, 10 to 15, whatever the rep range that I choose is. And then the down set, I would decrease the weight by half and I would do a set of 5. And on the 5th rep, I would hold that flexed position for 5 seconds, another set of 5, hold that 5 seconds on the 5th rep and do 3 to 4 rounds to failure with that isometric hold. If we're training quads and I want to, again, improve my knee flexion, I would do that isometric hold in the stretched position. So I would do my 5 reps, hold the stretch position in a loaded stretch, 5 reps, etc. So that's one of my main strategies is that stretch cluster or squeeze cluster, depending on which muscle group I'm trying to train.
This is the kind of, I think, science-based, optimal, evidence-based training that needs to be like talked about more. It's way harder to do, sounds way less cool than like line yourself up at this angle and hit the, this 7th vertebrae of
iliac
whatever
fibers,
on your
your
thing.
lat. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like give me a break. But like these things, matter. It's just fucking way harder to train that way. You have to be like, from a physical perspective, you also have to be so much more focused when you're counting your tempos and like paying attention to what position and what spot in the range of motion you're at, and remembering weights and changing like loading parameters set to set. Like, you have to be a little bit more dialed in mentally for your session. Oh, yeah. And that alone makes it more difficult. But this type of training is the most impactful for sure. And I think that more people should train this way. I know that since all of my injuries, like things like this, what you're describing, is more or less how I train most of the time. And it's made a world of a difference for me because of all the injuries that I've had. So, but again, it's hard, and I get why people don't do it, and it's not like that cool, but this is the stuff that matters.
I think people are just ignorant to it. I think they try to think like, oh, well, this is fancy, so it's not going to work. It's like, it's really not that fancy. And it's super simple if you think about it. A plus B equals C. So let's just put something in place that allows us to accomplish the goal. Let's be creative with it. Let's have some fun. Let's push ourselves, right? Listen, I did a set. So my blood flow restriction portion. So my workout yesterday for lower body was, I did 3 sets of seated leg curl. I did 2 heavy sets and then a squeeze cluster. Then I did adductors. I did a heavy set and then a rest pause set. For people who aren't familiar with a rest pause set, it's a set to about 1 RAR, rest 20 seconds, repeat to 1 RAR, rest 20 seconds, and then failure on that last set. So it's a cluster set essentially. Then I went over to the pendulum squat. And the pendulum squat, I did 1 heavy set, trying to get as low as I can with a 2-second pause on the bottom. And then I lowered the weight and I did a second set of 1.5 reps. So I would go to the bottom, pause, come up halfway, pause, back to the bottom, pause, and then all the way up. That's 1 rep. So I did 2 sets there. Then I did 2 sets of Romanian deadlifts. So barbell Romanian deadlifts. I did 1 heavy set and then 1 set with a 2-second pause on the bottom. And my finisher, like the last thing that I did, was a blood flow restriction triple set, which was walking lunges with body weight, assisted sissy squats, and a loaded quad stretch. That set was 3 rounds of 10 lunges per leg, 10 assisted sissy squats, and a 30-second stretch. That was an 8-minute set with blood flow restriction. That sucked. And no one knows how to actually push themselves when it comes time to actually do those hard things. Because I think, yeah, you and I could sit here and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But that's not the norm that a coach would implement something like that for a client. It's also not the norm where they would implement that and then ask the client to film it so that they could review it for video, if we're talking about an online client. So, I mean, I think there are coaches that do these things, but I also think that these are things that set us apart as, you know, the top tier of coaches doing the things that we do with the toolbox that we have. Is this applicable for all clients? No. But can it be implemented in a strategic way periodically to help our clients move through plateaus or to accomplish a goal? Yeah, absolutely. If I have any client with knee pain, you're friggin' right. I'm going to have them do blood flow restriction, leg extensions and loaded stretching and things like that, because that's going to help their knee pain. And guess what? If I can do it at 20 weeks post quad tears, I mean, those assisted sissy squats look pretty suspect, but I'm still getting into that deep stretch position. I'm still, you know, I'm pulling a lot with my upper body, but you know, we're getting it done.
Yeah. This is the thing. It's like, I don't know what exactly to refer to these kind of training things as. Like, it's certainly not what I would call like level 1 advice, right? Like the vast majority of people need to you need to get in the gym, you need to put the chips down, you need to get off Netflix, like you need to go outside for a walk once in a while and like see the sun. Like that is like the vast majority of kind of advice. That's not really actionable advice. It's too general and all that stuff. But like, that's what we're working towards. Like, and then eventually we have like some more strict training goals and we want to like push it. So, you know, call it level 2, 3, 4 advice and training and coaching and stuff like that. And that's where we get into this kind of stuff, where it matters more. But, you know, to the person who hasn't been to the gym in 6 years, like, yeah, do you need to do any of these things? Like, probably not. You need to just get into the gym. That's what you need to do first, and we'll get there. Yeah. But at the same time, someone who's like a very analytical thinker and is really like a type A type of person might thrive in this kind of environment where it's like, hey, let's just throw a bunch of stuff at you. And even though it's like kind of a little bit too much and unnecessary, maybe that's what gets you going and gets you motivated. Be like, oh, look at all the things I'm doing. I'm going to actually follow through on it. So there's, this is why personal training, the most important part of it is the personal part, because it's one person, one coach.
Absolutely. Like I've always said, like we use a client-centered coaching approach, right? It's a collaborative approach between coach and client to get the best results possible. It doesn't work unless there's collaboration and communication, and it has to have a high amount of touch points. And the clients that work with us know that we're involved in every aspect of it, and we're going to use all the tools at our disposal to be able to serve them in the best way possible. And the more often we can experiment on ourselves, as much as it sucked going through this hardship, it made me a better coach. It expanded my toolbox. It gave me a better understanding of how empathetic I can be. And in the flip side, it gave me a lot bigger of a bullshit monitor for when people are just lying to themselves. I mean, listen, I've got some clients where they'll send me videos. I'm like, hey man, I tore my quads and I'm lifting more weight than you. You need to step it up. And they're like, oh, you know what? You're right. I kind of sandbagged that. I'm like, yeah. So what are you doing? Well, you're wasting your time. And they're not very happy about that, but
no, but they are, because that's what gets them better, and that's what they need to hear, right? If they just wanted someone to tell them you're great and everything you're doing is perfect and like good job, Johnny, then they would have just hired a cheerleader, not a coach.
Exactly.
Paul, this has been great, man. I for sure learned a lot through this conversation. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we close off?
No, I think we're good, man. That was a great conversation. I mean, if anyone has any questions, comment, message me. I'm happy to answer.
Where can people reach you? What's the best ways? I know you've got a lot of things, so
we got a lot of things.
I'll put it all in the show notes, but let us know.
So if you're interested in coaching, you can reach out to me at www.masterathletic.com. You can click on my name or click on our application and select my name. You can find me on Instagram at Paul Oneid. You can also find my education site. So I do have a coaching education site that I operate called Coach's Corner University, and that's www.coachescorneru.com. We have our education collective, which is a library of close to 200 hours of continuing education lectures. Whether you're a coach, a personal trainer, or an athlete looking to inform themselves a little bit more, it's fantastic. And as a gift to your listeners, if they use the code podcast300, they can get $300 off. So it's lifetime access for $50.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for that.
No problem.
So guys, I'll put all that stuff in the show notes, but tap into everything that Paul's going on. There's a ton of great content and a ton of great resources for you guys. So take advantage of it. Paul, any last words before we close off?
Oh, man. No, just be present. I think if I had one lesson that I could tell people is be where your feet are. And that's, I think this day and age, there is a tendency to distract. There's a tendency to tune out. There's a tendency to avoid hard situations, but you'll get a lot more out of your life and your experiences if you just are where you are.
Love it. I love that a lot. Thank you very much for your time, Paul. No thank you guys all for listening. Make sure you're following. Like, share, subscribe, helps the message grow and get out to more people who need help. So I appreciate each and every one of you. Go outside, be a good person. See you next time.